Welcome to Redde-Zone Radio Podcast. I'm Rik Saylor, and today's interview is with Cynthia Grow. This episode is brought to you by our sponsor book, Exit Smart, where 10 industry leaders share their key insights on how companies are built to sell best and at the highest values. Cynthia, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me.
It's good having you on here. I know we've known each other for quite some time.
And I know
you've got such a great history in terms of background and how that business owners are going to know. Because that's really, Redde-Zone Radio, we just want to talk about how businesses run, talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and you all learn from it. So I know you're originally from Toledo, Ohio.
Yes.
You've got quite a resume, including movies, TV, radio, even including that historical piece on our very own hit king, Pete Rose. So I know that's a story in and of itself, and we could spend all day on this, but we're going to focus on a certain number of things.
Okay.
In business, you've been in banking, you've owned a construction company, a restaurant mesh, which is in part how we met, and then our common friend, the late Connie Morrow. Could you tell us a little bit about your work in these businesses, the types of customers you served and that you encountered?
Oh, boy, that's a full one. I used to be a banker, and a long time ago, I just realized, this was probably in the late 70s when I was a banker in the Cleveland area, and the architect would be drawing something up. The bank equipment guy had certain bank equipment sizes. The interior designer was doing her own thing, and nobody was bringing it together. So I happened to think, there's a need out there for this. And I eventually ended up designing and building banks and credit unions across the United States. During that time, my then husband decided he definitely wanted to own a restaurant. Being a former banker, I said, nope, because our chef said we'll make $1 million a year. And I said, you want to make $1 million a year? You put in $2 million a year. So unfortunately, most of the time it was true, but mesh was really unique. You don't even say those two words together, but the way we did mesh is because of my travels. I was in New York, I was LA, and I decided to bring a little bit of LA, combine it to New York, and brought it to Westchester, Ohio. It was an ideal time. It was a good, perfect storm. And we had great food, great people, great entertainment. And people ask me to this day, bring it back, and I'm like, no, get me a gun. But that's where I met wonderful people like yourself, and then so many people. But you do learn, because they call it what they call back of the house and front of the house in the restaurant industry, and you try to get those two staff people that have totally different ideas, like, I got to take care of the customer, and the chef is like, this food's got to be perfect. And they're saying it's taken too long, and where's the sous chef? And there was just always something chaos going on. And in the meantime, it was like putting on a show, a production. Nobody really sees what goes on behind the scenes in a restaurant. But through that transition, I was able to...
That's saying that we don't really want to know. They talk about that in regards to laws. You don't really want to know how sausage is made.
Well, I do know Elmer Hensler from Queen City Sausage, and I have seen, but he's got pure meat. But there's, especially hot dogs and bologna, you don't want to know how that's made. Yes, you're right. But no, it was just a matter of how do you treat people, and how do you want to be treated. I mean, it goes back to the basic golden rule. It's not, brain surgery. But through that, we had some really great staff members. At one time, Tony Ricci, who now has Tony's Restaurants, he used to be the maitre d' for Jeff Ruby at Jeff Ruby's Restaurants. He came to work for me for a while, and I always say he didn't work for me, he worked with me. Tony taught me as much as probably anybody. And then you had asked about the different people, wonderful customers.
Yeah, so,
great
on that
customers.
point, so I think about that, great companies have a commonality in that they have great people. We call it human capital in our world. And it's obviously people who are on the same bus, in the right seat, rowing in the same direction, which is actually a sailing metaphor. But it's that concept. So I'm always fascinated, where did your top companies or your top employees in your company come from, and how'd you find them?
Well, this was before when you used to put ads out. There was before it was LinkedIn and all the job search engines that you have now. I think one time I put in the Cincinnati Enquirer, are you a team player looking for a winning team? That was way long ago, but that's how I treated the staff too. We're always going to have a bad day. We're always going to have personality conflicts. How do you manage that? And in my construction company, what I did is because we were always having a constant fight with our project managers, our interior designers, because the interior designers would complain and say, well, we would ship the stuff to the project, but the project manager still hasn't given us the address of where we're supposed to be shipping this to. It was just simple things like that. So one weekend, what I did, I brought everybody in-house, and these are people from all over the United States that, especially the project
Before
managers.
Zoom, right?
Yes, yeah, because it would have been a lot cheaper with Zoom. But I brought them in, and I gave them job assignments. And let's say you were a project manager. Well, today you were becoming the interior designer. And maybe the project manager was answering, another project manager was answering the phone and have to field phone calls. And another one would have to pick out the fabrics and the carpeting. And through that, they got a connection. And they finally sort of walked a mile in each other's shoes.
Yeah.
And that's when the synergy happened.
Yeah. And now these were your employees.
Yes.
These were all people working for you. So I guess today you'd call that cross-training. Small companies not just survive on that, they thrive on that. And that you were pioneering those principles back in
way
70s?
Yep, 70s, 80s, mostly 80s. I started the construction company in the mid-80s.
Okay.
But even back then, working for a bank, again, you've got CEOs, you've got your president, CEO, you've got your vice presidents, and everybody has their own agenda too. And they have their own problems.
Sure.
I mean, one thing I've always asked my staff members in all the different companies, try not to bring your problems to work. You're going to have problems, you're going to have issues, but let's see if you're having a day, come and tell me. You're having a bad day. You're just not going to be able to function properly.
So you had that somewhat of the open door policy.
I guess, yes.
Yeah, where people could come in. I had a sign in my door for the longest time that said, my door is always open if you want to come in and talk about how the heck you can get out of my office. Just kidding.
Well, that's another thing that you brought up. It sparked a light in my mind. When we had open door, and how you have those open cubicles and everything, and you have architects and designers that are on deadlines. And they don't want to be interrupted. And how can they do that without being rude? And so I bought, I think it was at Cabela's, I bought orange hats. And if they were wearing that orange hat, that meant do not disturb. I'm not trying to be crabby. I want to get along with you, but I've got a deadline to make right now.
Leave me alone.
And it worked out great.
Red hats are coming.
Okay.
The red zone.
Yep.
And if you're wearing a blue hat, then you're working, I guess, in the wealth management side. So that's interesting. So as we kind of look and we're talking about some of these principles, but if you were to buy your ideal company or even build it today, what would you do to grow the business?
Well, they always say what you need to do is learn from others. And Lord knows I'm a graduate of the School of Hard Knocks. I mean, I have learned. You learn through your mistakes. But what is an ideal company? How can you even define that now? Because
so I think of that more. I mean, you've had so much experience. I guess my question would be, what was your favorite experience if there was one?
That's like saying, who's your favorite kid?
Okay.
Right?
Okay, yeah, I get that. But isn't it interesting how that our histories, and one of these things that I'd heard a while back was, your first 6 or 7 jobs, whatever the concept was, and that seems to be, this generation doesn't have that. I mean, what was your first, I think about, I'm just listening to the jobs about, you were in the banking business, which gave you exposure to how businesses run, and you knew which ones ran well and which didn't, who made money, who didn't, which maybe you didn't get as far as to talk about the values of companies. Maybe I know that I have to comply with that for lines of credit for my companies, but I mean, what an experience, in terms of how that built Progressive toward owning your own construction company, knowing what you knew about the restaurant business, and you still went into it. And I know that didn't end well, but at the end, I mean, these are things that, what do they say, if it doesn't kill us?
Yeah, well, I'm still here.
Still here.
Yeah.
You're still here.
Well, you know what? How I got into banking? I would go into the bank, and these ladies dressed so nice. The tellers dressed really beautiful. They're just, so I figured they made a lot of money. Now, you do remember I'm blonde, Polish, and from Toledo.
Yes.
So I'm sometimes come across with, oh, that probably wasn't a good idea. So in order to supplement that income, I also became a grocery cashier because it was right by the bank.
Yeah.
And so then that's how I got into that. So at nights and weekends, I would work at the grocery store as a cashier. During the day, a bank teller.
Okay.
And then that's when I started to move up. I think, you'll love this story. Some time ago, I was being interviewed by a bank in Cleveland area. And they closed the door, and way back when they did interviews, they didn't set a time. They just said you would sit in these metal chairs, and they were like a bunch of secretaries waiting to sit in these metal chairs and be the next one to be interviewed, right? And so I sit down, they close the door, and two gentlemen they used to call them personnel directors back then, and the new guy that was heading up this new department that he needed a secretary for. And I sat down, and they were asking me a bunch of questions, and then one of the questions I'll never forget was, Cynthia, if you get this job, how do we know you're not going to get pregnant? So I took a deep breath.
I don't think you could ask that question today.
No. And I said, gentlemen, I leaned forward. You do things with body language. Gentlemen, I don't know if you've heard about this relatively new government agency called EEOC. I said, and if you were to ask any of those women waiting out there that same question, you might have a lawsuit on your hands. So with that, I started to stand up and push my resume to them, and they said, sit down, you're hired. And I'm like, oh. And they said, and you're going to keep us out of trouble. And that's how I got my job in the banking, in the executive part of the banking division.
Oh, fantastic. Well, knowing what you know now, I mean, we've only just scratched the surface here. I wish we had all day to talk about these things. But knowing what you know now, what would you say, and tell our audience, what were your weaknesses as a business owner?
Oh, weaknesses. I had a hard time firing anyone. I always sort of saw their side or give them a benefit of a doubt, and it's like, and try to give them another chance. And, I know the whole routine where you bring them in and you give them compliments and then you zing them and then you compliment them again. But, letting a man go that, was not doing his work, but I know he's got a wife and kids at home.
Yeah.
That's my biggest weakness, was my heart.
Yeah. Yeah, and knowing what you know now, what have you learned? What would you do differently? Because I'm sure that our listeners, we all struggle with that. It's not our favorite thing. We, by nature, don't like conflict unless, I guess, you're a fighter.
Right.
UFC or, Muhammad Ali. And I think, they look for it. But, for the rest of us, I feel that same thing. I mean, I think my first business was solitary, an individual. I think about, again, the jobs I had, other than selling those door-to-door things as a kid, was having a paper route. And I actually was, collecting money. I was delivering a product, delivering a service. And, I look back on those days and the lessons I learned, went into retail, worked at a drive-through, had these ideas. I'm reading books on businesses when I'm 13 years old. Right. And wouldn't commit to play school sports because they took too much of my time and I had too many varied interests, to do it. But I look at, 27 years of having a wealth management firm and 43 years in the financial services industry, and then just launching here recently. I've always had a seat at the table in terms of when these businesses were maturing and growing and going to exit, we call it. But I always thought how critical that was to build these companies to sell from the start. Because there's zero difference between a company that's run well and one that's ready to sell. They're exactly the same. It's the same criterion, which is why we have the Max 4 program. You can catch that, on the tip of the week. But knowing your weaknesses, I think, actually becomes a strength.
Yeah.
Because then you can kind of buffer. Maybe that's why there's HR departments or for smaller companies, know when, again, listen to the tip section that comes out weekly, but outsource it to somebody and let them handle that part of it, and then it's not going to make it any easier, but at least what needs to get done gets done.
Well, as you know, it's so hard to wear so many hats. There's only so, and what you might be good in, I might be horrible in. So I really do believe in teamwork.
Oh, it's absolutely.
And I even had that on my wall. Together, everyone achieves more.
Right.
And,
Sure.
It's just reinforcing that. But some of the things that I did to help that with the employees, some that might be struggling, is we would have like a wine tasting event after hours.
Wine helps everything.
And, and I did educational programs and tried to send them to seminars. But the biggest thing, I think, as a boss, I never asked anyone to do anything that I couldn't or wouldn't do myself.
Yeah.
And I think that was another weakness that I had. I thought I could do it all. And that's, then that's when you're burning the candle at both ends.
Sure. Well, now your focus has shifted. You're familiar with the construction field. You now work with a restoration company, CR USA, which is, again, small world, how we reconnected.
Right.
Because our editing guy, Joe Smallwood, is actually, you guys are at the same company, so it reunited us after all these years. But you're also on the Liberty Center for the Welcome Committee, and you do this charity work with Holly's house, right?
Maddie's house, yeah.
Maddie's house. Okay. Well,
yes.
I think she's next door to
Right.
Holly.
Yeah. That's a really tragic story how Maddie's house came about. I think on Channel 9, Steve Raleigh, who's the chief meteorologist there. Julie, his wife, and I became friends years ago when we did the Extreme Home Makeover. Remember when that came to Westchester?
Yeah.
And they asked us to have a little fundraiser. They were short a little bit money to get the two young Acres girls that were both in wheelchairs, to get them wheelchair access van. So I had this great idea that I brought together like 20 people on one day. I did almost like a lunch and learn at Mesh. And I said, I need you here. I said, what are your strengths? What are your strengths? What's your weakness? And just went around, and we had, like I said, 20 people that came together. Within 1 week, we did a fundraiser at the Savannah Center and raised over $84,000. It was unheard of back then. And that was, 2009. And ABC actually asked Julie and I to come on the road with them. And we said, well, what are you going to pay us? And they're like, no, you get to be on ABC Extreme Home Makeover. I'm like, okay.
I'll pass.
I don't understand that. And then you had to get your own RV, too. I thought at least they'd supply an RV, right? But they did not. But that's how I got to know Julie. Julie and Steve have 4 wonderful kids. And Madison was always a little bit troubled. And then she fell into some addiction problems, alcohol problems. And Julie and Steve did everything to try to get her. She'd be in rehab, she'd come back, she'd be good for a while, and then she'd have a relapse. And Julie, when Madison did die, and it was a very tragic death, Julie said, I'm going to make something good happen out of this.
Good for her.
And what it is, Talbot House does a good job. There's a lot of rehab places, but there was never a place for young children, or I call them children because at my age they are still children, but young adults, teenagers, to go where it would be fun. So Julie and Steve have arcade games, thanks to Walton's Games. A good friend of ours, Bruce Walton, and Jan were so kind to donate things. People were so giving. And we're seeing a lot of success with Maddie's house now. And there's a lot of young kids that come there. We're going to be building a gym, and it's going to be named after Cy Lease. Cy Lease is the former Hamilton County Sheriff. I think of about 30 years. He'll correct me when he hears this. Cy Lease was his granddaughter that died. So, and Cy Lease, a real true Marine, still works out to this day, and so the gym's going to be named after him.
Fantastic.
And, as a nice tribute.
Fantastic work.
Yeah.
Well, how can people get in touch with you?
Oh, very easy. I'll give you my cell phone number. I'll give you my
You
email
give as much
address.
as you'd like, because I'm sure that you can get some follow-up calls on something in the long cachet of things we've covered today.
Well, my email is Visioneer, that's Visioneer @live.com. That's because I was hired by Disney to be an Imagineer, and you cannot use that word. You don't mess with the mouse. So that's where Visioneer came up from. And my phone number, my cell phone number is 513-515-0169. Now, I might not pick up right away because I don't understand. I don't want these robocalls and everything. So you have to leave a message. But if you hear my voiceover, it's done by Steve Raleigh, Chief Meteorologist. So don't hang up.
That's classic. Well, Cynthia, thank you for being on the show today.
Rick. It was good seeing you.
Thank you. It was great seeing you again and in this venue and just tapping into your wealth of knowledge and experience, and I look forward to having you back on the show. Well, we would love to have you on our show and hear your company's story on Redde-Zone Radio. Please visit our website at Redde-Zone.com. Shoot us an email or call our phone number at 513-454-1360. And if you benefited from today's interview, be sure and give us a thumbs up and share it with your colleagues and your friends. And to obtain your absolutely free copy of Exit Smart, where 10 industry leaders share their built-to-sell insights that you can use right away, go to the website, click the book, complete your information, we'll get it right out to you. Oh yeah, let us know if you'd like an autographed copy. We'd love to do so. You can also receive a free subscription to our e-newsletter, Redde-Zone Insights, just by requesting it. Well, that's this week's interview. See you soon.